Shalom, friends and ministry leaders, and welcome to the King of Kings Ministries Connection. Here's what's happening right now across the network. Hello and welcome to our many prayer and ministry partners and all of our friends all over the world. Thank you for joining us here as we try to unpack for you some of the details of the events that took place just a few days ago at the pavilion in the city of Jerusalem. Now, on Thursday, June 22nd, there was a worship event called One Voice that was planned by the Messianic Jewish Alliance of Israel. Now, this was a scheduled event. Tickets were purchased months in advance, and many Messianic groups and congregations from all across Israel came to participate together in this event. Now, shortly before things got started, an Orthodox Jewish religious group staged a protest outside of the pavilion doors that quickly grew into a riot as this group tried to physically prevent anyone from participating in the worship event or even getting into the pavilion at all. Now, I was able to speak with Pastor Chad Holland, the senior pastor of King of Kings Community Jerusalem, where the event was held. Now, Pastor Chad was also at the worship event the night the protest took place. Here's what he had to say. So joining us right now from Jerusalem is Pastor Chad Holland. Pastor Chad, thank you so much for taking just a minute to kind of give us some context about what happened. So can you start to describe for us what the event was that the protesters were trying to disrupt?
Well, this past Thursday night, we had a joint congregational body-wide worship and musical event at the King of Kings Pavilion. We put together two shows through the Messianic Jewish Alliance of Israel and a collaboration of worshipers from many congregations. So this was the event that they were looking to disrupt. They were trying to not let worshipers get into the facility. They were trying to block the doors. They actually sat down in front of the doors. They were protesting, shouting. They had noisemakers. They were preventing families from getting anywhere near the sanctuary to enjoy the worship time. It was a blessing for the body of Messiah because we try to be a catalyst for unity by putting on and hosting these things. Now, just to be clear, King of Kings was not the sponsor of this event, although we were participating in the event as much as we were able, but we were the host physically for the event at the King of Kings Pavilion. So the event was a joint congregational body-wide worship night that the protesters did not want the people to participate in.
Pastor Chad, where did you say the event was taking place?
This particular event was a unity event for the whole body of Messiah. It was held at the King of Kings Pavilion in our main sanctuary. It's a theater that seats over 500 people, and it's a great space. We did two shows that night, a 5 o'clock and a 7:30 showing, and the protesters arrived about 4:30, trying to prevent people from coming in the pavilion, but the pavilion was the physical location of this worship event.
Who were the people that were coming to take part of that event?
Well, we sent an invitation out to the whole body of Messiah in lots of different venues and delivery methods. So the people trying to attend the event were generally, they were believers in Yeshua as Messiah. They were worshipers, members of many other congregations and ministries around the Jerusalem area. All of the people had previously registered online and had already bought their tickets. So there was not a sense of people coming and being coerced or being tricked or being confused about why they were there. These were people who knew what they were doing. They had previously, like I mentioned, they had already bought tickets online. They were presenting the tickets at the front door. So they were well aware of what the night was involved in, what the vision was. No one was tricked or coerced to come.
From your vantage point, what do you think that the protesters were trying to accomplish?
I think the protesters were primarily trying to disrupt the worship opportunity. They presented all kinds of different propaganda and reasons why they were protesting, reasons why they were blocking. They were saying, you know, as believers, we should leave the country, we shouldn't be here. But, you know, in a certain sense, that's an ignorant statement because many of the people attending are Israeli citizens. Many of them were born in Israel. So there would be no justification to back up that claim. They were just simply unhappy that there are Jewish believers in Yeshua the Messiah, that Jewish believers believe that Yeshua fulfills the prophetic words of the Bible, that he is the promised Messiah. And that's what they really didn't like. And because they can't come straight out and say that they had to conjure up these other ideas or these other pieces of propaganda, like we were tricking children, we were stealing children, we're poisoning people, we're tricking people. But as I mentioned before, everyone that entered the worship event had pre-registered. They had already known what the event was about, and they had bought tickets for it. So we found that kind of ironic that that was the accusation.
Well, what action steps did these protesters take to try to accomplish the goals that they were doing?
I think the ultimate goal was to prevent us from worshiping and to intimidate people, to intimidate the body of Messiah. What they were trying to do was make lots of noise, be very intimidating. They were blocking not just entry and exit, but they were physically blocking people. They were trying to scare families. We had several elderly that turned away and went back. Lots of families that went back, children crying, people getting hurt. They did practice pretty regularly violence and pushing down, kicking, pinching they love to do as well. But physically blocking was what they were primarily trying to do to prevent the worshipers from going in. And they were screaming and yelling all kind of obscenities. They had dirty mouths. They really weren't there to have any dialogue, any debate, to find out any truth. They had made up the propaganda. They really just wanted to protest the idea that there could be Jewish believers in the Messiah.
Do you think that these protesters were successful from what you saw?
On the one hand, you might say the protesters were mildly successful because they did turn others back. Many did not go in. They were afraid, they were intimidated, or they had been hurt. The police did a good job, but they showed up very late to the event between the first concert and the second concert. But the first group of police that showed up were inadequate to control the amount of this crowd. And there were somewhere between 80 to 100 protesters or rioters, the violent people that came.
Oh, wow.
Were they overall successful? Praise God, no, they weren't.
Amen.
By our count, there were somewhere between 700 and 800 people that had registered or bought tickets or arrived in person and participated eventually in one or both of the worship events. So while they might have succeeded on a small level, they certainly did not succeed in intimidating all of these hundreds of people that really desired to come and worship the Lord with us that night.
Did you see any injuries as a result of the rioting?
Unfortunately, there were quite a few people that were injured from some of our own workers and our own servants and our own ushers. They certainly were pushed down, pushed against the wall, hit, kicked, pinched, screamed at. But unfortunately, there were also elderly people with canes that got pushed around and pushed down, pushed against the wall.
Oh, wow.
There were young mothers with babies in their arms that they were still physically assaulted.
Wow.
So this particular group really showed their character, because they weren't only protesting able-bodied people, they were protesting the elderly, mothers. They were harming and intimidating children, screaming at them. This became the concerning part of the night. Is they were no respecter of who they hurt. And I think that really shows the ugly character of the people that showed up in protest.
You know, who was behind this? Do we know? Is there an organization? Is this just a group of people? Who was behind this protest?
So this clearly was not a random group that just happened upon the worship night. This was a planned event. Several days in advance of the event, there was a group called Lehava that had put out videos, and they had stirred up their supporters. They had given false claims and lies in their social media platforms, their Facebook platforms and Twitter, to try to conjure up a group of people to come. And behind the Lehava group, we know who the leadership is. We know them by name. And what I do want to say is, predominantly, the gross number of youngsters who showed up, these young adults who showed up, probably did not show up just out of the goodness of their heart or the belief in the cause.
Right.
Actually, they were paid. They were paid by Lehava and its leaders to come and cause problems and to create a disruption, to cause noise and harm.
Wow.
And be violent. They were paid to do that. So the irony here is that the Lehava group had to pay people to come and do their dirty work, while the worshipers voluntarily paid and registered to come to the worship event. So the irony there is they were accusing us of tricking people and coercing people, when the irony is that they were actually the ones coercing people to come to the event and cause problems.
But did you know about this ahead of time? Was there any kind of planned, security or anything like that for the event?
We got a lot of questions about, did you anticipate this protest and riots and this violence? And the answer is yes, we did. We had actually hired already through our pavilion company extra security for the night. We secured police and armed security guards, trained security guards, as well as putting out our own ushering and security team. But what happened was, as the mob grew to somewhere between 80 and 100 people,
Wow.
they overwhelmed the security team.
Sure.
And not everybody in our usher team and our security internally or the hired security guards have the authority to push back and fight back physically. Only the police have that.
I see.
But there were only 5 or 6 police. And when you have almost 100 rioters and 5 or 6 police, eventually the police had to give up. They backed off and they gave the full right-of-way to these rioters and protesters to block the door and to harm people. It was not until several hours later that we're so thankful that the second wave of 15 to 20 police officers armed and in their full gear showed up. And then they were able to bring order and clear up the situation and allow the worshipers to enter and exit safely, even though the rioters still tried to stop the worshipers and to create chaos. But that second wave of police came and sorted things out for us in a safe way. So we're very grateful to the police for all that they tried to do and how they tried to organize. They did a good job, but simply they did not send enough police early enough in the event, and it took 2 hours before the full police team got there and brought order to what was happening.
So what you're saying then is that the security measures were inadequate.
The security was not adequate in the beginning because the security guards that were hired are not authorized to fight back.
Sure.
And
Makes
our
sense.
ushers are certainly not going to fight back. We're trying to keep the peace.
Right.
And so the armed police officers that were sent were only 5 or 6. And when you're measuring 80 to 100 protesters and rioters creating violence, causing an uproar, 5 or 6 police obviously can't control that many people. So within the first 30 minutes, the police officers backed off. They gave up. They moved to the side.
Wow.
And they gave the right-of-way to all of the rioters that were there, the protesters who were there.
Wow.
About 2 hours later, we were thankful that a second wave of police showed up, just about 20 of them in number, and they took full control of the situation, allowing the worshipers to primarily come in a peaceful way and to exit in a peaceful way. They were able to push the protesters back and prevent them from harming anybody else. So early on, the security really wasn't adequate, even though we had prepped as well as we could. It's just that the police didn't send enough people. Later, when they sent more people, the security was adequate with people who had the authority to fight back to the protesters.
Yeah, and in that context, what did the security and the police do for the worshipers at the event?
Early on, when the event was beginning and the first worshipers were arriving, the early security team tried to perform and build a channel against the wall that the worshipers could walk through without being harmed by the protesters.
I see.
That lasted a few minutes, but ultimately, as the mob grew and as the violence grew, the police had to back off and give up, and that really prevented many other worshipers from entering. But later, when the larger group of police arrived, they were able to physically form a line and push back all of the protesters to a certain line. And then there was another set of security officers that would go into the crowd and grab worshipers trying to come through the crowd, push back those that were violent until they could cross the line of the policemen. And when the worshipers were safely across the line of the policemen, they would release them into our hands and we would welcome them into the worship center. So we're so grateful for both the line of police that pushed back the rioters and the police that went into the crowd to free the worshipers trying to arrive, because they were being accosted. They were being harassed physically as they were trying to make their way into the worship space.
Now, you had mentioned that there was 2 concerts. Now, was there a difference between the 2, or were those just mirrored concerts?
Well, during the opening of the first worship concert, there just was not an adequate number of police that had the authority to fight back. We had some extra ushers. We also had hired extra security, but they don't have the same security clearance to push back with a measure of authority or a measure of force.
Right.
So they had to back off. So the first worship concert had far fewer people because many were afraid. They had been harassed physically. There was violence that was happening on the ground floor, so they had to turn back. By the time the second wave of police arrived, there was a little bit more order and safety, and more worshipers could come in. Some of the people who had turned back out of fear and safety in the first concert, they happened to come back in the second concert, and we had an overflowing house in the second worship event. So there was a little bit of a difference in both the security, the police force, and the number of worshipers that came, and the sense of security and safety that was presented to all of the worshipers who had voluntarily come and registered and bought their own tickets to be there.
So how many people ended up being at the overall concert event?
By our measurement, there were somewhere between 700 and 800 worshipers that had come. They had pre-registered online. They had bought tickets. They were presenting their tickets. So clearly they knew what the event was.
Of course.
They knew what they wanted to connect with at the event. They had already done this with full knowledge of what was happening. So we believe there was somewhere between 700 and 800 people attending this wonderful worship event that was a unity event for all of the body of Messiah here around the Jerusalem area. But we do believe, by our measurements, there was about 700 or 800 that eventually came. They worshiped. They had a great night in the presence of the Lord.
Well, thank you, Pastor Chad, for the time. I appreciate you taking a minute. You know, events like what happened at the pavilion, just a simple worship night, really do serve as a reminder that spiritual warfare in Jerusalem is very active and very, very fierce. I'm reminded of Ephesians chapter 6. The Apostle Paul wrote, "We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand in the day of evil." Now, my friends, your brothers and your sisters in Jerusalem are standing for truth, and they're giving proper worship to Yeshua HaMashiach, the King of the universe. And like Yeshua, they're suffering for the sake of righteousness. So we ask that you pray. Please pray for the peace and the safety of the King of Kings ministries. Pray for the body of Messiah in Jerusalem. And please prayerfully consider supporting our work financially here on the ground in Jerusalem. We cannot do this without you. You have the opportunity right now to take part in this work with us as God's kingdom is advanced here in Jerusalem and around the world. Don't wait. Join us.